Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Digital Science Speaker Series. We are thrilled to be bringing this back after a short recess due to the small matter of a very large pandemic. I'm Dr. Suze Kundu, Director of Researcher and Community Engagement at Digital Science, and I am thrilled to be joined by our first returning live speaker, Dr. Chris van Tulleken. Our paths have crossed a few times. I was thinking of the last time I actually saw you, and I think it was genuinely at Cheltenham Science Festival over breakfast, where you and your brother, also a doctor, also a science communicator, were ranking bodily fluids in order of preference, which was brilliant. And I think that's just a brilliant way for me to hand over to you to try and sum up who you are and your career in 30 seconds. Good luck.
Do I need to give the ranking, or can we skip the bodily fluids?
You can skip them for now. We might circle back.
My career in 30 seconds.
Yeah.
So my career is a bit of a mess because I wasn't someone with a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan or even a 10-minute plan. As I qualified as a doctor just over 20 years ago. And about 5 years after I qualified, I started doing bits of presenting for the BBC. And I started doing more of that as I became an academic. So I've specialized into infectious diseases medicine. And that seems like it might be quite a long way from what I do now. But infectious diseases are problems that really only affect disadvantaged people. Very few people with money. And if we think about the rich parts of the world compared to the poor parts of the world, infections are a problem of people who are disadvantaged. So that gave me an interest in global health. And nutrition, because people who are poorly nourished also get infections. So as I became an academic infectious diseases doctor, I started presenting a show called Operation Ouch on Children's BBC. And that really opened all the doors. It's a show about science and medicine for kids, and it won 2 BAFTAs its first 2 years. I'm very proud of it. And it's been going now. We're about to start series 13. But it turns out that all of the important, powerful people in the country have kids of about the age that watch Operation Ouch. So it opened all these sort of amazing doors and continues to do so. And so my BBC career grew alongside my kind of academic career and my clinical career. And for a while, it was a Ponzi scheme of time with these 3 different projects parasitizing each other, and it was very complicated. Now everything really pulls together. My clinical work is about people who are disadvantaged. My academic work is about commercial determinants of health, so how companies affect our health, particularly food companies. And my broadcasting and my writing is mainly about how companies affect our health, whether it's pharma or food or gambling or tobacco or alcohol. So that's where I've ended up.
Your mother must be so proud. Honestly, you really do put the rest of us to shame. It's terrifying.
People say this. So my mother, people may be reassured to know that I had dinner with my mother and my 2 brothers a little while ago. People always think she must be proud. And we got into some row over dinner, and she was going, I just don't know where I went wrong with you all. You know, my mum's very lovely. I think my mum has moments of, my mum knows all the stuff I'm not talking about here.
Oh, well, that's a mother's privilege. We'll call it that. So you've talked about your interest in nutrition, and this very much perfectly leads to the book that you recently released and the topic of your talk next week. So it's this ultra processed people, and it's all about how much processing goes into the foods we eat, how often some of the things that we're consuming are doing nothing for us and can almost barely be classified as nutritional matter. I just wondered if you can tell us a little bit about that, about the book, your journey through exploring it and investigating the topic, and what you'd really love to see from the release of this book.
So, doing a lot of broadcasting for millions and millions of people over a decade, I made hundreds of hours of television, and a lot of it was about food, and a lot of it was about weight loss. And so this is what doctors talk about on social media, on television, on radio, is basically how to lose weight and what to eat. And I realized that my colleagues and I at the BBC were giving really good advice to people about what to eat. And we did this over a 10-year period to millions of people over hundreds of hours. And the nation, and particularly the nation's children, continued to gain weight and become shorter and become more malnourished. And so my interest was in going, why are people unable to follow this excellent advice that I'm giving them? Well, are they feckless and lazy, or is there something about their environment that's constraining them? And of course, now the idea of going on television or radio and telling people what they should or should not eat is repellent to me, because we don't really have a choice about what we eat. Particularly people who have less money have very, very little choice about what they eat. And in the UK, we've seen over 50 years our diet changed from a traditional diet to a diet that is really mainly an ultra-processed diet. And there's been a lot in the press, partly because of the book and a program and a podcast I did. There's been a huge amount of interest in ultra-processed food and its definition, which is very long and formal, but is broadly anything with an additive you don't find in a domestic kitchen. Really, the definition, we could define the food that causes disease in a lot of different ways. And ultra-processed food happens to be the definition that has the best evidence. We've got a decade, we've got hundreds of prospective epidemiological studies, we've got clinical trials, we've got lab evidence. There's thousands of papers explaining why this is now the leading cause of early death on planet Earth. So it's overtaken tobacco. When people are asking about ultra-processed food, the thing I want people to understand is this is just a way of describing the Western industrialized American diet. It's agonizing over any particular ingredient or particular product. It's about your dietary pattern. And so the book is a lot of different things. The book is about social justice. It's about the commodification of ill health for profit for transnational corporations. It's about what this Western pattern of eating destroys. It destroys not just traditional food culture and all the oral knowledge that goes with it, but it destroys what food means, because we've come, really because of the food industry, to think of food as just the stuff we put in our mouths. And when we think about the effect of food, we think about what it does to our physical bodies. Food is the stuff that binds us to the people around us. It shapes our landscape. It affects our environment. So the book is trying to get people to think about food as more than that. And I guess at the heart of the book, there is this experiment where people are invited to eat as much ultra-processed food as they like while they read, because I think engaging with the substance as an addictive product is a really helpful way of quitting it if that's what you want to do.
I think we can all really relate to that feeling as well. We all have these so-called guilty pleasures of things that we're craving, and we know they're terrible. Well, we don't all know that they're terrible for us, but that's sort of part of that educational process, the engagement with the public on this topic. So I guess what I find quite interesting is we do have this level of ultra processing of the things that we're eating, but that's sort of going hand in hand with the amount of food that we need to be producing. There's maybe a sustainability aspect towards this as well. What would you like to see happen from this? You've exposed the data, you've told the stories. Now what?
There are two things I would like to happen. One is, I think that people don't want to eat this food. Now, the companies are very good at positioning it as sort of, people should be allowed to choose what they want. And I believe that. I believe very passionately people should be able to eat bad food. I wouldn't ban cigarettes. I would not ban alcohol. I would not ban any drugs of abuse. So I'm quite libertarian in that regard. But I do think people need to have true choice. And at the moment, people don't have the freedom to buy affordable, healthy food. It's not available. It's not affordable food for them. So I would like everyone to have access to the best information about what food does to them. So we need to put warnings about ultra processing in our national nutrition guidance. We need to limit the marketing of the food, because that falsely represents a lot of it as healthy and beneficial for our health. So that, I think, I'm interested in giving people the information that they can then make a choice. Now, the evidence shows that when people have money and advantage in education, they choose not to eat this food. So broadly, people like you and I, who are educated and have financial resources. We just don't eat much of it. That's entirely different to people with low incomes. So the second thing is to go, well, how can government interact with this? The number one, and this is going to speak, I think, to a bit about what we're going to talk about, science communication, is the most important thing about science communication is you communicate truth in an unbiased way. And we have libraries of data showing that the industries that profit from particular scientific endeavors are very good at biasing them and distorting them, whether it's drugs or weapons or food or anything else. And so the most important thing, and most of my work focuses on reducing the conflicts of interest around food policy. So if we think of the major charities that influence policy, of food policy in this country, they are all funded by companies that make ultra-processed food. Any big food policy charity you can think of. The best example, and I name them because this is well evidenced and they talk about this, is the British Nutrition Foundation. They advise government, they release public-facing documents, and they're majority funded by the major food companies that we could all name. So disentangling the conflicts from policy is sort of the most important step. If you have a population that is educated about food and is able to afford it, plus you don't have policymakers being influenced by big food, almost the rest of the problem solves itself. We then need to do the suite of things that we did with tobacco. So we need to treat the companies like the tobacco companies or like the pharmaceutical companies, and understand that publicly limited companies can't act in the public interest. They have obligations to their owners. And so they're not being evil. They're just doing what they're required to do, what their whole purpose is, which is make money for their owners. And to expect them to have a sort of interest in community, society, the environment, public health is sort of really unfair, actually. So government needs to regulate the industry. The industry will kick and scream and bring lawsuits. But in the end, what we also know is this is not a Marxist agenda. It's not anti-capitalism. You can have huge economic growth, massive employment, lots of productivity, but you just need to realign your food system to have public health in the best interest. That requires government oversight.
Because ultimately...
So I want a grassroots movement and I want to reduce conflict. Sorry,
no, this is brilliant. I love the long answers because they are so detailed, so informative, and actually really kind of clearly laid out. And there's also the aspect of the fact that if we are to address a situation like this, ultimately, as a nation, we will spend less money on the things like healthcare that needs to be applied to a range of people that are suffering the consequences of poor nutrition and things. So really, it's in everybody's benefit to be doing this, to be committing to a healthier way of being in a range of different ways. And I think we will come back to this when we talk about science communication, but I do think a lot of what we really need to do is build that healthy skepticism and the confidence to think critically about these things. And I think part of what you're talking about, eliminating bias, or at least highlighting the lens through which things are being delivered so that people can better understand, okay, this is being presented, but there is a real slant towards me wanting to go for this because this company is trying to make money, and trying to get people to remember that part of the process when they're deciding whether to do something and whether not to do something. Now, this certainly is not your first investigative research piece. I had the privilege of seeing you speak about the work that you did around baby formula. I just wondered whether you can explain some of the work that you did around that and the outcomes of that as well, because a lot of your work does have positive impact on policy change as well, doesn't it?
So I'll talk specifically about the infant formula campaign, because it was a really good example of taking academic work, turning it into a BBC documentary, turning that BBC documentary into more academic work and more press interest, and creating significant policy change. Formula is a really charged thing to talk about. And I want to make it really clear. I do not care how people feed their children. All parents, almost without exception, want to feed their children in the best way. It's a very personal, complicated thing. I am a formula baby. My mum fed me and my two brothers formula, and I love her for it. She had to get back to work, and she created an environment where I have lots of freedom to do things. She made money. So the problem with the environment at the moment is our food environment is bad, whether or not you choose to feed your child formula milk or breast milk. All of the medical education around formula and around its use is sponsored by the formula industry. The particular thing we were investigating was a huge rise in the diagnosis of cow's milk protein allergy in both formula and breastfed infants. And there are two issues with this. Kids on cheap, good formula were being switched who had very vague symptoms like a non-specific rash, slight diarrhea, slight constipation, crying a lot, not crying much, sleepiness, sleeplessness. Essentially, the diagnostic criteria made it impossible to exclude any healthy child. And these kids were being diagnosed with cow's milk protein allergy and switched to very expensive formulas that either the parents were paying for or the NHS was paying for. Additionally, parents who were breastfeeding their kids were told that dairy proteins from the mother's diet could get into the breast milk and could be causing this similar range of very vague, non-specific symptoms. Now, the guidelines that outlined the symptoms were funded by the companies that were making the specialist formulas. The NICE committee that supported the guidelines were also all funded by these companies. The patient charities, the patient-facing charities with the helplines were funded by the companies. The medical education around diagnosis and the basic scientific research, they had complete capture. On Mumsnet, there were dietitians answering questions who were paid by the companies. There were patient-facing websites run by the companies. So a total 360-degree coverage. And so what we campaigned on was, first of all, to say there's no evidence for any of this. There's almost no evidence that an exclusively breastfed child, and you will understand this, I think, as a chemist, that when we eat protein, it is broken down almost entirely into its constituent parts before any of it gets. You don't eat cow's milk and then secrete it in maternal milk. So the risk of a breastfed child having this problem is, extremely low, and yet almost every mother I knew was excluding dairy, including my own wife, who was trying to breastfeed at the time. So we pointed out these conflicts of interest. We put it in a BBC documentary. We then published it in the British Medical Journal. I then wrote an article in the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail got picked up by the Times of India. This story went global. And we started to apply pressure to the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, who have enormous influence and who were taking money from the two main formula companies, and whose president at the time had just accepted a position on the scientific board of one of the formula companies. So my point is, whether you were a parent trying to formula feed or trying to breastfeed your kid, this was a terrible situation. And we changed the guideline, and the Royal College stopped taking the money, and the British Medical Journal, midway through publishing all this, went, hold on, we run ads for these products. And they took the incredibly courageous step, Fee Godley turned down a huge amount of money in advertising. The BMJ group of journalists now don't have any advertising of any product from any formula company. So that was a very cool story. I got to say, that was 2018. And 6 years later, there are new guidelines that promote this diagnosis. There's still, there's still very loose regulation. These milks are still being paid for in enormous quantities. And in China and South Asia, this diagnosis is really expanding. So the companies, we had this one little success, but the marketing budget of these companies is, is just outpaces the entire spending budget of a public health agency. So it's billions.
Gosh, it's wild, isn't it? I just think if we had real greater transparency and availability of that information, it would really help people. But we do need that piece about supporting the public and the consumers of this information to be able to make those better informed decisions. But I think the thing you mentioned about the BMJ is just such a perfect example of how it's not just researchers working in isolation, and it's not just consumers. We're all part of this much broader community. And so actually having a publisher, having a journal decide to change the way they're doing things can have massive impacts further down the line in how that is then being perceived. So I think that kind of leads me then to my next question. You are in an amazing position as a researcher, as a medic, as a communicator, to be able to have these platforms for engagement with almost every different group of the public, from young children through Operation Ouch, all the way through to some of your BBC documentaries. And you have that patient interface as well. You really get to interact with everybody. What is the role of science communication? How important is it to help develop confidence in that healthy skepticism, and how important is it in maybe building trust in research that's going on that is ultimately supposed to be helping the public?
So I think there are lots of different kinds of science communicators. Part of my job is kind of to undermine our trust in some science. And that's a space I occupy. And some communicators just have no interest in being there and probably shouldn't be there. So there's a lot of science communicators who are really good friends of mine, and they are there to celebrate the institution and the technical side of science and the knowledge it produces and the way and the methodology of science. I'm really there to critique, or at least I see my role as critiquing the biases and the weaknesses, or the way that science can be co-opted and used to do harm, because it's not a neutral tool, and that feels like the space I'm interested in, because I think of the work I've done in particularly in South Asia and Central Africa, where I've seen companies so drastically affect the most vulnerable populations on Earth. So my job is really to go, science at its very best and its purest is this just incredible tool for making the planet and the world a better place, but it is very easily turned against public interest and toward private interest. So if we think of the science around ultra processed food, there is a bit of a debate around some of the science going on in the media. So there are people like me who are saying ultra processed food is a problem, but there have been a small number of articles going, oh, the evidence doesn't really make sense. When we look at who those articles are written by, they appear to be written by academics or journalists. What is never said is that every single one of them, almost without exception, is written by someone who's funded by one of the companies that makes ultra processed food. And we've done a network analysis of this, and all of the academic critique of the concept of ultra processed food, almost without exception, is industry funded. If you go to scientists who take a pay cut to work on ultra processed food, i.e. they work in the independent sector, there's not much money, they're public servants, usually for public health bodies. So you would hope that they would really be quite unbiased, because they're really not refusing money. There is almost universal agreement this is an enormous public health problem. So I feel my little drum that I'm banging is, if we could get the conflicts out of science, that would be a huge step forward. And what we know is we can't mitigate them. So we all think, you and I can both read a scientific paper, but we know from research on how biases work that actually even real experts reading a paper with industrial funding that we know goes against all the other independent literature often can't identify the source of the bias. It's not, no one's being fraudulent, but bias creeps in ways that are undetectable through normal analytic techniques. So conflicts are a huge problem, and I would like science to be a much cleaner endeavor than it is, especially when it comes to public health.
Absolutely. I think what we're trying to do at Digital Science is make a small contribution to that conversation, using technology to help people identify things like trust markers in publications and things, just to really flag up the robustness of the research, or the research integrity, or sometimes lack of, behind different publications and things. And I do think it at least gives people just something to try and make sense of it if they're not familiar with it. One of my other big bugbears, I think, also
I
is the
think that
fact
that
that,
stuff
oh,
is
sorry, go
so
on.
important because I would like people to be able to trust science, particularly medical science, particularly public health, nutrition science. We should be able to trust it all. And it's only profit incentives, I think, that really interfere with that. There's the odd
Mhm.
bit of individual fraud, but that's small potatoes.
Yeah. I think the other thing that has always frustrated me is the fact that we do the research, we publish that research with the noble mission of sharing it with the world so that other people can access that information, understand what we've done, reproduce what we've done, and build on it. And yet, nothing about how we publish research really supports that. We write in really obfuscatory ways. Work is often behind paywalls and things. And although there is a huge open research movement, that can then come at a cost, because when we talk about trust in research, we're then opening this world out to anyone that can almost cherry pick a publication that suits their ideas. It's that confirmation bias. And so I think there's so much work that needs to be done. And I'm not going to rant about this because we'll be here for another hour and we don't have the time for that. But there is, a real effort to be made by all actors within the research ecosystem to try and overcome that for the betterment of research and society that should be impacting from that research as well. I am
Could
going to
not
stop
agree more.
ranting there. I promise I'll
It's a
stop
good
ranting.
rant. It's a really good rant.
It's very frustrating though. But I think, the more people get angry about this across the world, the better, because then we can just start a revolution.
I mean, I did an investigation of the Russian vaccine, the Sputnik vaccine, and
Mm-hmm.
it was published. The phase 2 and 3 trials were published by the Lancet, and there were huge inconsistencies in the data that were published, and we really kind of exposed the frailty of peer review. That the peer reviewers who'd endorsed heartily this new
Mm-hmm.
vaccine had no access to any of the raw data. And
Yeah.
once you start explaining to the public that a publication in the Lancet has been through a couple of reviewers who've looked at it for free for a few hours, and the difference between that and stringent drug regulatory review, people don't really appreciate that. So yeah, no,
Mm-hmm.
the way we publish, the standards we use to determine truth, and the paywalls,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, all need to be overhauled. I love your
No,
rant.
they really do. Thanks. But I think you make a really good point there as well, that a really big part of what you do, that skepticism that you're exposing people to, I think really helps people understand the processes through which the research goes through, and the fact that everything should be up for criticism, because that is science. We
Yes.
work in this amazing field where somebody saying that something's wrong is not a bad thing. It's an opportunity to then develop something new or better. And I think that's really nice. And I think the fact that most researchers do have that is great. It's just not something we really talk about. So one of the reasons that we have the speaker series, for example, is to bring these stories to life. And tease, it's great. Um, so I wanted to pick your brains on inclusion in research. You were speaking earlier about how your work as an infectious disease researcher predominantly impacts people who may be less privileged. And we do have a bit of a problem in research whereby huge groups of society are either underrepresented in a clinical trial, or the adoption of a research based solution hasn't really been considered based on their own lived experiences. And there's also a real imbalance in funding for diseases that impact different demographics of people. For example, a while back, we did a hackathon where we looked at funding data for sickle cell disease, which is something that impacts people in Africa, versus cystic fibrosis, which impacts fewer people but predominantly based in the global south. And the differences were outstanding.
Let me guess.
Okay, go on. So tell me what you think the imbalance is.
Cystic fibrosis got more than double.
Yeah, you're thinking along the right lines. So both are terrible diseases, but cystic fibrosis has had 1.9 billion pounds of funding, and it affects 100,000 people worldwide. Sickle cell disease gets less funding, as you said, but it's £1.7 billion. However, it affects 2 million people worldwide. So, not just in Africa, but in the African diaspora as well. And that's just one example of how research data can expose this lack of inclusion. So I wonder whether you can tell us a little bit about how your work is contributing to greater inclusion in and engagement with research.
I mean, not surprising, but still shocking.
So I wonder whether you can tell us a little bit about how your work is contributing to greater inclusion in and engagement with research.
I'm conscious that I'm answering this question as someone with enormous privilege in every way, and not just the privilege of my culture and gender and the kind of school I went to, but the sort of biggest privilege of all, which is having enough money. And in a sense, my inclusion in any of these projects is potentially really problematic if I'm not quite a minority voice. So I hope that whether it's a BBC project or the Lancet series I'm working on or any piece of academic work, I and the teams I work in aggressively try and include all kinds of marginalized voices, including people who are from different backgrounds. I guess I mean in terms of income, that it's very easy to have a group of culturally diverse people, but who really are fundamentally all middle class. So that's what I try to do, and but there is something inherently problematic that as someone like me, I mean, if you look at the food activists in this country, Jamie Oliver, me, Henry Dimbleby, we're probably the three most visible people. Maybe Tim Spector and Michael Mosley, you could throw them in there as well. They're not so much activists about the food system. I mean, look at us all. We all went to the same university, you know. I mean, Jamie came from a different background perhaps, but we're all now rich, middle-aged white guys. And we're not really affected by the problems we talk about. So I hope that at least in the book, I have worked quite hard to, not just for the optics, but because I don't understand aspects of this problem through lived experience. So I have tried very hard to go and put voices on the page who understand it, whether they're voices from communities that eat different foods or voices from people without much money. So I try, but I think often people like me have to just go, I'm not going to be involved. You've got to give my space to someone else.
Yeah, that's such a well-considered answer. But I also think the fact that the impact of your work is so tangible already is incredibly important. So using your platform for good is definitely the way forward.
Suze, it's such a pleasure speaking to you as always, and I really hope I see you soon. Thanks for your lovely, lovely questions.
Honestly, the pleasure was all mine. If you would like to read Chris's book, Ultra Processed People, Why Do We Eat Stuff That Isn't Food and Why Can't We Stop?, you can find it in your favourite bookstore, either on your local high street or online.